The day my brother stood up in that boardroom and said, "She has no idea what she's doing." She never did. I didn't say a word. I just folded my hands on the table and waited. Everyone was looking at me. The lawyers, the bank representatives, my brother's business partner with his smug little half-smile. They were all waiting for me to cry or argue or walk out. I did none of those things. What none of them knew, what my brother had apparently never bothered to find out, was that I had been the one keeping the lights on for 3 years. Not him, me. Let me back up. Our father built Callaway Contracting from nothing. He started it in a rented garage in Mississauga in 1987, with 2 trucks and a crew of 4. By the time I was old enough to understand what he did, the company had grown into a mid-size commercial construction firm with contracts across the GTA. We did schools, community centers, the occasional condo development. Nothing flashy, solid, consistent work. Dad was proud of it in the way people are proud of things they built with their hands. He always said the business would go to whoever wanted it most. My brother Wade wanted it loudest. That was different. I was the quiet one. I went to Ryerson, U of T now. I got my degree in finance, spent 4 years at a firm in downtown Toronto doing project audits. Wade spent those same years driving one of Dad's trucks, complaining about the foreman, and telling anyone who'd listen that he was being underutilized. He had big ideas: expansion, rebranding, residential development. Dad listened patiently and said things like "let's see" and "maybe next year." When Dad had his stroke in the spring of 2019, everything shifted. He survived, but the recovery was long, and there were months where he couldn't be in the office at all. Someone had to step in. Wade assumed it would be him. He started signing things, making calls, introducing himself to clients as acting director. Nobody stopped him because nobody wanted the confrontation. I didn't say anything either. Not then. What I did instead was start paying attention. I came in on weekends. I went through the books. What I found wasn't criminal, exactly. Wade wasn't stealing, but it wasn't good either. He'd moved 3 contracts to a new supplier run by his college friend, one who charged 15% above market rate. He'd approved overtime on 2 jobs that hadn't needed it, and the billing discrepancies on the Etobicoke School project were the kind of thing that would eventually catch an auditor's eye. He wasn't malicious, he was sloppy, and he was loyal to the wrong people, and he had no idea what the numbers actually meant. I brought it to Dad quietly, during one of his better weeks. He listened. He asked me to take over the financial oversight. Wade found out. He was furious. We had the kind of argument that leaves marks. The type where things get said that both people know they'll never fully take back. He told me I was trying to steal what was his. I told him I was trying to make sure there was something left to inherit. He told me to stay in my lane. I stayed in the office. Over the next 2 years, while Wade handled operations and client relationships and the things he was genuinely good at, I restructured our supplier contracts, renegotiated our line of credit with TD, and quietly brought in an outside firm to audit the Etobicoke mess before it became a liability. I also did something else, something I didn't tell anyone about. Our father had always kept a personal reserve, a private account he'd set up in the early days as a kind of insurance policy. When he was sick and his legal affairs were being sorted out, he transferred a significant portion of that reserve into a holding structure I helped him establish. The holding company owned a minority stake in Callaway Contracting, and the holding company was managed by me. Not given to me. Managed by me on his behalf, with his full knowledge and his signature on every document. Dad recovered enough to return part-time by late 2020. He never fully regained his stamina, but his mind was sharp. He watched what I'd done to the books. He didn't say much, but he updated his will, and he had our family lawyer, a careful woman named Ms. Ostrowski, draw up a shareholder agreement that I was asked to review and sign. I signed it. Wade didn't know what was in it. I'm not sure he knew it existed. By 2022, Dad was talking about retirement. Wade took that as confirmation that the company was finally going to be his. He started making plans. Hired a consultant, some guy he'd met at a golf tournament in Collingwood, to develop a growth strategy that involved acquiring 2 smaller firms and moving into luxury residential. He had decks made. He presented them to Dad over Sunday dinners like a kid showing off a science fair project. Dad nodded and said, "Let's see." What Wade didn't know was that Dad had already been in conversations with a development group out of Calgary that wanted to acquire a majority stake in Callaway. Not a full sale. A strategic partnership. They'd come in at 51%. Dad would retain a board seat, and the remaining shares would be distributed according to the shareholder agreement, the one I had already signed. I found out about the Calgary group in March of 2023 when Ms. Ostrowski called to let me know the deal was moving forward and asked if I had any questions about how my shares would be affected. I had a few. We talked for an hour. By the end of that call, I understood exactly what my position was going to look like once the deal closed. Wade found out about the Calgary group 2 weeks before closing. I know because I was in the kitchen when he called Dad, and I could hear him through the phone from across the room. He wasn't screaming exactly, but he was close. Dad's voice stayed even. He said he'd made the decision he thought was best for the company. Wade came to my apartment that night. He stood in my doorway and said, "You knew about this, didn't you?" It wasn't a question. I said yes. He said I had gone behind his back, that I had manipulated Dad when he was vulnerable, that I was always jealous of what he'd built, that I never understood operations, that I was a paper pusher who'd spent 2 years moving money around and thought that made me important. He said a lot of things. I stood there and I let him say them. Then I closed the door. The closing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in April. A boardroom on King Street West, one of those glass and steel towers where everything looks expensive and the water glasses are always full. Ms. Ostrowski was there. The Calgary group's legal team was there. Wade had brought his own lawyer, a guy I didn't recognize, youngish, confident in the way that people are confident when they don't yet know how much they don't know. Dad wasn't there. He'd had a difficult week, and his doctor had advised against the stress of a full legal proceeding. He'd given Miss Ostrowski his proxy. I was there because I was party to the shareholder agreement, and my signature was required on 3 of the closing documents. Wade didn't look at me when I walked in. He was talking to his lawyer in a low voice, and when I sat down across from them, he finally glanced over and said, loudly enough that the whole room could hear, "I don't know why she's here. She doesn't have any real stake in this. She's just the bookkeeper." The Calgary group's lead counsel, a measured older man, looked up from his papers. He looked at Wade. Then he looked at me. Then he looked back down at his papers without saying anything. I didn't respond. Miss Ostrowski cleared her throat and said we should probably get started. The first 40 minutes were procedural. Documents circulated, initials were placed, representations were confirmed. Wade's lawyer kept raising small objections, nothing substantive, just the kind of friction that makes younger lawyers feel useful. Wade himself kept making comments under his breath. At one point he said, to no one in particular, "This whole thing could have been structured better if people who actually understood the business had been involved from the start." His lawyer put a hand on his arm. I kept my eyes on the documents. Then we reached the section of the closing that dealt with the shareholder agreement and the distribution of the remaining 49% of shares not being acquired by the Calgary group. Wade's lawyer, for the first time, looked genuinely uncertain. He leaned over and said something to Wade. Wade frowned. He looked at the document. He looked at Ms. Ostrowski. He said, "This is wrong." Ms. Ostrowski said, "I can assure you it isn't." Wade said, "She's listed as holding 22%. That's not right. She doesn't have any shares in this company." Quiet. The kind of quiet that has weight. Ms. Ostrowski opened her folder and placed a document on the table. The shareholder agreement. The one with Wade's father's signature and mine and Ms. Ostrowski's as witness, dated November 2021. She said, "Your father established a holding structure in 2019, at the time of his illness, to protect the company's equity in the event of his incapacitation. The management of that holding company was assigned to your sister. As manager, she was authorized to act on its behalf and, per the terms of the restructuring agreement your father signed in November 2021, a portion of the equity held by the holding company, was transferred to her personally as compensation for services rendered during the period of his medical leave. Wade said, "What services?" Ostrowski said, "Financial restructuring, audit remediation, renegotiation of the TD credit facility, management of the Etobicoke liability, among others." Wade said, "She was never paid for any of that." Ostrowski said, "She was in equity." Wade turned to me. His face had gone the kind of pale that takes a moment to fully arrive. He said, "You did this. You went behind my back and you convinced him to give you shares." I said, "Dad decided what he thought was fair. I signed what he asked me to sign." Wade said, "You manipulated him. He was sick. He didn't know what he was doing." The Calgary Group's lead counsel set down his pen. He looked at Wade over his reading glasses with an expression I can only describe as tired patience. The look of someone who has sat in too many rooms with too many people who are learning difficult things too late. He said, "Mr. Calloway, are you prepared to allege that your father lacked capacity at the time of this agreement?" Wade didn't answer. The lawyer said, "Because if you are, we'll need to pause this closing and involve the courts, which will delay the transaction, trigger a material adverse clause in our letter of intent, and potentially void the entire deal." Wade looked at his own lawyer. His lawyer looked at the table. The Calgary lawyer said quietly, "The agreement your sister signed is properly executed, witnessed, and filed. We've reviewed it. Our position is that it's valid." Wade said, "She's just the bookkeeper." Nobody responded to that. I said, "Dad used to say that the numbers don't lie. You just have to know how to read them." I don't know why I said it, it just came out. It's something Dad actually used to say, back when he was teaching me to read a balance sheet when I was 16. Sitting at the kitchen table in our house in Brampton with his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. Wade stood up. He said he needed a few minutes. He and his lawyer went into the hallway. They were out there for 22 minutes. I know because I was watching the clock on the wall and I needed something to look at. When they came back, Wade sat down. He didn't say anything else about the shares. His lawyer made a few more small requests, minor language adjustments, a clarification on the transition period, and Miss Ostrowski accommodated most of them. The rest of the closing proceeded without incident. Everyone signed. Afterward, in the elevator on the way down, it was just me and Miss Ostrowski. She said, "That went reasonably well." I said, "He's going to be angry for a long time." She said, "Probably. But anger is a lot cheaper than a legal challenge he wouldn't win." She was right about that. What I didn't tell her, what I haven't really told anyone until now, is that I spent most of that closing trying not to think about the summer I was 11. When Wade was 15 and he taught me to ride a bike in the parking lot of our church on a Saturday afternoon. Patient in a way he wasn't always patient, running alongside me and telling me I had it. I had it, even when I clearly didn't. Or the time he drove 4 hours to Hamilton in a snowstorm when my car broke down during my second year of school and didn't ask for anything in return. People are not simple. Even the ones who disappoint you. The deal closed. The Calgary Group took their majority stake. I received my 22%, which under the terms of the acquisition translated to a payout that I will not disclose here, but that meant I could stop renting my condo and actually buy something. I also retained a seat on the newly formed advisory board, representing the minority shareholders' interests during the 5-year transition period. Wade received his portion of the remaining shares, a larger percentage than mine, as was appropriate given that he'd been active in operations for years longer. He's now working with the new ownership group as director of operations. He's good at that part. He genuinely is. We haven't had a real conversation since April. He texted me in May to tell me that Dad was having a good month, which I already knew. I texted back and said I was glad. It's not nothing. Dad called me the week after the closing. His voice was steadier than it had been in a while. He said, "Miss Ostrowski told me it went fine." I said it did. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I always knew you understood the business. I don't think I ever told you that." I said, "You didn't have to." He said, "I know. But I should have said it anyway." I've thought about that call a lot, about what it means to be seen by someone too late, and whether too late is the same as never, and whether the answer to that question changes depending on the day you ask it. I don't have a clean answer. I'm not sure there is one. What I know is this. I didn't do any of it to hurt my brother. I didn't engineer anything. I showed up, I did the work, and I signed the papers that my father asked me to sign. I kept the company alive during a period when no one else was paying close enough attention to notice it was bleeding. And when the moment came, the documents spoke for themselves. The numbers don't lie. You just have to know how to read them.